For decades, the promise was simple. Technology would level the playing field. It would give latecomers a chance to leap ahead. But with artificial intelligence, something very different is happening. In quiet rooms at historic estates like Bletchley Park, and later in Seoul and Paris, the rules of the AI age are being discussed and written, largely without the voices of the global South. The language sounds inclusive. The rhetoric speaks of opportunity, growth, and human development. Yet beneath it lies a harder truth. Governance is drifting away, just as AI is becoming more powerful, more intrusive, and more consequential for societies least able to absorb its shocks. I want you to pause on that idea, because who writes the rules of AI will determine who bears its risks. If this question matters to you, if you believe technology should serve people, not sideline them, stay with me. Because to understand what's at stake, we need to look at how this global conversation quietly shifted and who it left behind. What we are really debating here is not technology, it is power. The AI governance debate is often framed as a technical challenge: how to control advanced systems, how to prevent misuse, how to avoid catastrophic outcomes. But in practice, it has become a political process shaped by who convenes the meetings, who sets the agenda, and whose risks are treated as urgent. At Bletchley Park, the focus was safety, even existential threat. In Seoul, innovation and inclusivity were added to the mix. By Paris, the conversation had tilted further toward deployment and acceleration. Now, with the summit moving to India, the emphasis is shifting again toward impact, productivity, and growth. On the surface, this sounds reasonable. For emerging economies, AI is framed as an opportunity to catch up, to grow faster, to become prosperous before demographic pressures set in. But this framing also narrows the debate. It turns governance into a secondary concern, something to be dealt with later. And that raises a deeper question: what happens when impact is prioritized before protection? To answer that, we need to understand how this imbalance came to exist in the first place. To understand that imbalance, we have to step back. The global AI governance landscape did not emerge overnight. It followed familiar economic and political cycles. Innovation concentrated first in high-income economies. Regulation followed where power already existed. Between 2011 and 2023, nearly two-thirds of the world's AI policies, standards, and guidelines came from the United States, Europe, and China. Africa accounted for just 2%. Latin America and the Caribbean, 5%. This is not accidental. Governance tends to trail capital, talent, and institutional capacity. Countries that build frontier models also define what risks matter: loss of control, model misuse, disinformation at scale, disruption to established labor markets. These concerns are real, but they reflect the anxieties of societies already wealthy, already industrialized, already buffered by institutions. Meanwhile, the global South encounters a different reality: AI arriving not as a distant future risk, but as an immediate economic and social force. History shows this pattern clearly. Technologies developed elsewhere are imported quickly, governed slowly, and adapted poorly. The rules arrive late, if at all, and that gap between adoption and protection is where the first real crisis begins to form. The first crisis is already here, and it is unfolding quietly. Across the global South, AI is not replacing high-paying, abstract jobs. It is reshaping the most fragile layers of the labor market. Workers earning $1 or $2 an hour label images, flag toxic content, and train moderation systems. They are feeding the data pipelines that make AI powerful, often at significant psychological cost. In Kenya, data workers exposed daily to violent and graphic material have spoken about trauma, anxiety, and long-term harm. In India, call center employees help build customer service bots now designed to automate their own jobs. This is not speculation. It is a present-tense reality. What makes this a crisis is not automation itself. It is the structure around it. The productivity gains flow north. The risks and human costs stay local. Governance frameworks written elsewhere rarely address this imbalance. They treat labor displacement as a future adjustment problem, not as a current extraction model. If you are watching this and wondering why AI feels less like empowerment and more like pressure, this is why. And it forces us to ask a harder question, because behind these visible effects lies a deeper, less obvious system at work. What's driving this pattern is not neglect, it's design. Global AI governance is built around a simple but powerful mechanism: rules follow incentives. And today, the strongest incentives belong to those who develop, deploy, and profit from AI at scale. The systems are trained in one part of the world, governed in another, and deployed everywhere. Data flows outward, value flows upward. For many countries in the global south, AI governance arrives packaged standards, benchmarks, and best practices shaped by assumptions that do not travel well. Assumptions about strong labor protections, independent regulators, legal systems that can enforce accountability, media ecosystems resilient to manipulation. When those assumptions fail, governance fails with them. This is why focusing narrowly on innovation and impact is so dangerous. Without enforceable safeguards, AI does not simply boost productivity. It amplifies existing asymmetries. Data becomes extraction rather than ownership. Automation becomes displacement without transition. Surveillance tools spread faster than oversight. The result is not a lack of progress, but a misallocation of risk. And once these systems are embedded into labor markets, public services, and political processes, the next crisis becomes harder to contain, because the consequences don't stop at workers, they move outward into society itself. The second crisis is sharper and far more destabilizing. AI systems are increasingly being deployed in environments with weak oversight and limited avenues for redress. Biometric identification, predictive policing, automated decision-making, tools that reshape power relationships between the state and the citizen, often without transparency or consent. In fragile institutional settings, these systems don't just make mistakes, they harden them. Bias becomes policy, errors become invisible, and accountability dissolves into code. Elections are especially vulnerable, where trust in media is thin and verification mechanisms are weak. AI-driven manipulation can distort reality at scale. Synthetic content spreads faster than institutions can respond. Doubt becomes a political weapon. This is not a future risk. It is already unfolding in places where governance capacity is stretched and public scrutiny is limited. Yet global AI discussions still frame these dangers as secondary side effects to be managed later. The irony is striking. The places most exposed to these harms have the least influence over the rules meant to prevent them. And that brings us to the most important question of all. What does this mean for you, for ordinary people living with these systems every day? If you live in the global south, this debate is not abstract. It is personal. You feel it when jobs become more precarious, not because technology arrived, but because protections didn't. You feel it when automated systems make decisions about credit, welfare, policing, or identification, and there is no clear way to challenge them. You feel it when elections feel noisier, more confusing, less trustworthy. And here is the uncomfortable truth. None of this happens because AI is evil. It happens because governance lagged behind deployment. You were told AI would bring opportunity, and it can, but opportunity without safeguards shifts risk onto people least able to absorb it, onto workers, onto communities, onto citizens. If you've ever wondered why progress sometimes feels like pressure, why innovation feels imposed rather than chosen, this is the missing piece. Because governance is not about slowing technology down. It is about deciding who it works for. If this resonates with you, if you believe people should have a voice in shaping the systems that shape their lives, pause here, share this conversation, talk about it, because what happens next doesn't stop at national borders. The effects are already rippling outward, reshaping the global balance itself. These choices don't stay local, they compound globally. When AI governance fails in one region, the effects travel. Labor standards weaken across borders, data extracted in one country, trained systems deployed everywhere. Political manipulation techniques tested in fragile democracies don't remain contained, they scale. This is how asymmetry becomes geopolitics. Countries that control AI standards gain more than economic advantage. They gain narrative power. They define what responsible use looks like. They decide which harms count as acceptable trade-offs. Meanwhile, countries without a seat at the table become rule takers, adapting after the fact to systems already embedded in their economies and institutions. The danger is not a single bad policy, it is path dependence. Once AI systems shape global supply chains, public administration, and information flows, reversing course becomes extraordinarily difficult. In this sense, the AI governance divide mirrors older patterns of globalization, but faster, more automated, and harder to see. And that is why the next phase matters so much, because the future is not fixed yet. It will be shaped by the choices made now, by hosts, by agendas, and by whether emerging economies insist on more than symbolic inclusion, which brings us to the question of what comes next, and what paths still remain open. There are three paths ahead, and none of them are neutral. The first is optimistic. India, backed by other global South actors, uses its moment not just to host, but to reshape the agenda. Governance is pulled back to the center. Labor protections, data ownership, representative training data, and human rights enforcement become non-negotiable pillars of global AI rules. Impact and safety are no longer treated as trade-offs, but as interdependent. In this future, AI becomes a tool for development without repeating old patterns of extraction. The second path is muddled. The language of inclusion continues, but enforcement remains weak. Summits multiply, declarations are issued, deployment accelerates, some harms are mitigated at the margins, but the structural imbalance remains. The Global South gains access to AI, but not influence over its trajectory. The third path is darker. Governance continues to drift. Impact is celebrated. Safety is sidelined. AI systems spread rapidly into labor markets, public services, and political systems ill-equipped to absorb them. By the time the risks are fully visible, the rules are already locked in. History suggests systems tend toward the path of least resistance, unless someone intervenes. And that leaves us with one final question: what should be done now? This is the moment that will be remembered. Years from now, people will not ask how fast AI spread. They will ask who shaped it and who was left to absorb its consequences. Hosting an AI summit in the Global South should have been a turning point. Not a symbolic gesture, but a structural shift. A moment to insist that labor protections matter as much as productivity, that human rights enforcement is not a luxury, that impact without governance is not empowerment, it is exposure. For India and for other emerging economies, the opportunity is still there. But it requires more than optimism. It requires pressure from governments willing to demand accountability, from civil society insisting on transparency, and from people like you refusing to accept a future designed elsewhere. Because governance is not an obstacle to innovation. It is the condition that makes innovation legitimate. If this analysis helped you see the AI debate more clearly, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, start the conversation, and stay curious, because the next chapter of AI governance is being written right now, and the question is simple: will you have a voice in it?